The lights blazed hot against the polished desk. Cameras trained on every twitch and every breath. It wasn't just another interview. It was a nationally televised clash, streamed to millions, dissected by pundits before the segment even ended. And at that desk sat Kash Patel, exuding the smug confidence of a man who thought he had already won. His lips curled into a half-smile as he leaned forward, ready to play the part of the bulldozer. With the host barely finishing a question, Patel pounced. His words dripped with condescension, slicing not just at Jasmine Crockett's arguments, but at her very presence. "Congresswoman," he said with a mocking chuckle, "maybe if you actually understood how the real world works, we could take your opinion seriously." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. Some smirked in complicity, others winced at the blatant dismissal. It was the kind of line Patel had delivered 100 times before, arrogant, sharp, meant to belittle and shut down. But this time was different. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't shuffle her papers. She didn't frown. She didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk, her gaze locking onto Patel with a calm intensity that made the air suddenly feel heavier. The smirk on Patel's face lingered, but the silence in the room stretched long enough to crack it at the edges. The camera caught it. The poised congresswoman, unshaken, eyes burning with quiet resolve. Viewers at home could feel the shift, as though they were witnessing the prelude to something unforgettable. The host glanced between them, sensing the charge in the air. Patel looked ready to laugh it off, but the silence was no longer his. It belonged to her. And then came the hook. Crockett's voice, steady and sharp, sliced through the tension. What happened in the next 10 seconds, she promised, would turn this debate upside down. The audience leaned in. The country leaned in. What could she possibly say? The smug dismissal had been thrown, the gauntlet laid at her feet. But Jasmine Crockett was not a woman to be underestimated. Not here. Not now. Because this moment wasn't just about a debate. It was about who gets dismissed, who gets erased, and who dares to answer back. And the answer she was about to give would ripple far beyond the studio walls. The silence that hung in the studio wasn't just about two people locked in a verbal spar. It was a mirror of the country itself, fractured, tense, waiting for clarity in an era when clarity felt impossible. America was standing at a crossroads. Truth versus propaganda, dignity versus arrogance, the fight for identity and belonging versus the machinery of power that thrived on division. And in that split second before Jasmine Crockett spoke, you could feel all of it in the air. Kash Patel didn't arrive at this desk as a neutral guest. He had built his career not as an impartial servant of the people, but as one of Donald Trump's most loyal defenders. In backrooms and cable news appearances alike, he had perfected the art of bluster, dismissing evidence, attacking opponents, deflecting with rehearsed arrogance. To his admirers, he was a gladiator. To his critics, he was a mouthpiece for corruption. Tonight, Patel sat back in his chair as though the stage belonged to him, as though the rules of engagement would bend the way they always had. But across from him sat someone who had no intention of playing by his rules. Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to trade half-truths or duck hard questions. She was part of a new wave of leadership, unwilling to shrink herself in the face of intimidation. She didn't carry the weight of privilege. She carried the weight of survival, of representing voices too often pushed aside. To the progressive, immigrant, working-class audience watching at home, she wasn't just another politician. She was proof that someone who looked like them, sounded like them, and fought for them could take a seat at the table and hold it. That's why the stakes were so high. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a battle for what America chooses. To reward, would arrogance and dismissal continue to dominate? Or could integrity and composure finally claim the spotlight? Millions were watching not only for entertainment, but for validation. In Crockett's response, people yearned for more than a clever retort. They wanted a moment that cut through the fog of noise and revealed truth in a way that couldn't be ignored. The tension fed itself. On social media, live reactions were already pouring in. Clips were being cut and shared in real time. Did he really just say that? One viewer tweeted as Patel's condescension replayed on a loop, comment, sections lit up with anger and anticipation. And yet, just as quickly, others typed words of hope. Wait until you see how she answers. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just reacting to a cheap insult. She was carrying the weight of every person who had ever been dismissed in a meeting, talked over in a classroom, or belittled for daring to speak. Patel had delivered his smirk, his laugh line, his cheap dismissal, but in doing so, he had written the first line of his own undoing. The stage was set. The audience could feel it. Something inside that studio was about to snap, not with chaos, but with precision. Crockett had leaned forward, eyes steady, a storm contained behind her calm. And while Patel looked certain that he had just scored another effortless victory, the truth was that he had wandered into uncharted territory, because no one in the room, no one watching at home, expected what would come next. And when it landed, Kash Patel, the man who had built his image on never losing composure, would be left utterly speechless to understand the arrogance that Kash Patel carried into that studio. You have to understand where he came from and the what kind of role he had chosen for himself in the American political machine. Patel wasn't just another commentator dragged onto cable TV to fill airtime. He was an insider, one of those names that surfaced again and again in Trump-era scandals, always lingering just close enough to the flame to bask in its heat, yet slippery enough to avoid getting burned. He started as a lawyer and a federal prosecutor, then rose through the ranks in the intelligence world. On paper, it looked like a story of public service. In reality, Patel had mastered a darker art, bending institutions not toward truth or fairness, but toward the service of power. When Donald Trump entered the White House, Patel found his true stage, quickly established himself as one of Trump's most loyal operatives, working behind the scenes to protect the president from the consequences of his own decisions. It wasn't just loyalty, it was performance. Became the shield, the deflector, the enforcer. He wasn't afraid to attack anyone, Democrats, journalists, career officials, if it meant insulating Trump. When investigations loomed, Patel was the one dismissing them as witch hunts. When critics raised concerns about corruption, Patel painted them as liars or deep state conspirators. He perfected the tone, smug, dismissive, laughing off serious charges as though they were beneath him. And it worked, at least for a while. Television producers loved him because he brought fire. Supporters loved him because he seemed fearless. In his world, arrogance wasn't a flaw, it was a weapon. He wielded it like armor, brushing off contradictions, skating past inconvenient truths. No matter the setting, congressional hearing, cable news panel, think tank stage, Patel leaned into his role as the man who could sneer his way through scrutiny. But arrogance has a way of breeding overconfidence, and overconfidence blinds. By the time he sat across from Jasmine Crockett, Patel was convinced he was untouchable. He had faced seasoned prosecutors, veteran journalists, and even members of Congress, time after time. He'd leaned on his smirk and his dismissals, and somehow it was enough. The narrative always twisted in his favor, his deflections echoed by partisan media outlets, sound bites clipped and amplified by an eager echo chamber. He had built an entire identity around the idea that he could never be rattled. In his eyes, Jasmine Crockett was just another opponent, another critic to be brushed aside. To Patel, she was young, relatively new to the national stage, and far less experienced in the brutal blood sport of Washington spin. He thought he had her figured out before she even opened her mouth, and that was his fatal mistake. Because what Patel didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that Crockett didn't play the game by his rules. Where he relied on arrogance, she relied on preparation. Where he used bluster, she used precision. Where he leaned on dismissiveness, she leaned on truth. And the truth has a way of cutting through even the most rehearsed performance. But in that moment, Patel's mind was elsewhere. He was running his old playbook, confident that his smirk and his jab had already won the segment. He had delivered. His punchline, mocking her intelligence, belittling her voice on, he was ready for the usual outcome. His opponent rattled, fumbling, unable to match his dismissive swagger. That was the cycle he knew, the cycle that had worked so many times before. What he didn't know was that the cycle was about to end, because across the table sat someone was built for this very moment, to grasp the power of what Jasmine Crockett unleashed in that studio. You have to first know the road she walked to get there. Unlike Kash Patel, who built his career by orbiting around power, Crockett built hers by standing with people who had none. Her story didn't begin with television lights or primetime debates. It began in courtrooms that smelled of old carpet and desperation, where the underdogs of society, people who couldn't afford lawyers, people whose names were forgotten by the system, found in her a fighter who refused to let them be crushed. She wasn't drawn to law because it promised prestige. She was drawn because she understood deeply what it felt like to be dismissed, to be underestimated, to be told, wait your turn or stay quiet. For her, the courtroom wasn't just a profession. It was a battleground where dignity itself was on trial. In those early days, Crockett took on cases that others shied away from. Tenants bullied by landlords, workers silenced by employers, families chewed up by bureaucracy. She earned a reputation quickly, not as someone who made friends with the powerful, but as someone who made enemies of bullies, and she wore that reputation proudly. Her clients weren't just case files. There were people who saw in her something rare. A lawyer who didn't just speak for them, but spoke like them, who carried their frustration and their hope into every argument. It wasn't an easy path. The paychecks were small, the hours endless. Friends wondered why she didn't pivot to something more comfortable, something with less resistance. But Crockett wasn't wired for comfort. She was wired for confrontation, not in the sense of anger, but in the sense of facing what others ran from. If there was injustice, she leaned into it. If there was a bully, she stepped closer. That instinct, born of grit and sharpened by countless fights, became the core of her public life. Her leap into politics wasn't a vanity move. It was a necessity. She saw how systemic the problems were, how the same faces and forces that belittled her clients were writing the very laws that kept them down. Running for office wasn't about ambition. It was about expanding the battlefield. In Congress, she became known quickly for her sharp questioning, her unwillingness to play along with pageantry, and her ability to pierce through jargon with wit that was both devastating and refreshing. There's a reason progressives saw her as a rising star. In a political landscape crowded with rehearsed talking points, Crockett's words cut clean because they were real. She wasn't performing for applause. She was channeling the same unflinching voice she had used in courtrooms, only now the courtroom was the nation, and the stakes were even higher, and she wasn't afraid of being underestimated. In fact, she seemed to thrive on it. Time and again, opponents who mistook her calm demeanor for weakness found themselves flat-footed when she struck with precision. She had wit like a blade, but it wasn't reckless. It was measured. Where others shouted, she stayed composed. Where others scrambled for sound bites, she waited for the perfect pause. It's the exact phrasing that would land like a tuner. That she revealed, she revealed, she revealed. She made her opponents expose themselves, and then she calmly held up the mirror. That's why. For millions who followed her career, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a politician. She was a kind of proxy, a reminder that those who have been talked over, dismissed, or written off could find vindication through her voice. She carried that mantle not as a burden but as a charge. It made her formidable. So when she walked into that studio and sat across from Kash Patel, she didn't carry nerves or intimidation. She carried every courtroom where she had dismantled arrogance. She carried every hearing where she had outmaneuvered bluster. She carried every memory of someone who had told her, you don't belong here. It's only to be proven wrong. For Patel, this was just another stage to dominate. For Crockett, this was familiar terrain. She had spent her life preparing for men like him, the smirkers, the interrupters, the ones who thought volume was the same thing as truth. He had his playbook of dismissals, the same script he had run against countless opponents before. But Crockett wasn't just another opponent. She was the exception to his rule, the crack in his armor, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't stepping into his world. He was stepping into hers. And when she leaned forward that night, eyes unblinking, the perfect storm of her experience met the hollow force of his arrogance. So when Patel tried his usual tricks, what he didn't realize was that he had walked into her arena. The moderator tried to keep the discussion moving, but Patel was in no mood to yield ground. He spoke rapidly, firing off accusations, weaving half-truths into his narrative as though speed itself could substitute for accuracy. Each time Crockett began to answer, he raised his voice just enough to cut her off. The smirk returned, stretching wider, telegraphing to the audience that he believed he had control of the room. "You just don't get it, Congresswoman," he sneered, waving his hand dismissively as though shooing away a child. "This isn't law school. This is the real world." There it was again, the condescension, the arrogance, the dismissal. Patel leaned back, satisfied, his words echoing with the swagger of someone who believed the conversation was his to dictate. The moderator shifted uneasily, unsure whether to intervene, while the studio audience murmured, restless with the tension building between the two figures on stage. But Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean in to interrupt. Instead, she sat poised, hands folded on the desk, watching Patel unravel his own case with every smug flourish. Her calmness wasn't passivity, it was precision. She let the audience see the contrast for themselves. A man interrupting, over-talking, trying desperately to dominate, and a woman waiting with steady patience, her composure more powerful than any raised voice could be. The effect began to ripple through the crowd. Some members of the audience shifted in their seats, eyebrows raised. A few exchanged glances as if to say, "He's overplaying this." You could almost feel the current shift respect draining from Patel as he rambled on, intrigue gathering around. Crockett, as she sat there, unbothered, as though she were simply waiting for the right moment. Patel noticed the shifting energy too, and it made him double down. He jabbed his finger in her direction, his tone rising in pitch. "You've had your talking points handed to you, and you're parroting them like every other partisan hack. Admit it, to don't even understand half of what you're saying." Insult hung in the air, harsher than before. Gasps escaped pockets of the audience. It was the kind of cheap shot that might rattle most people, might push them into shouting back. It's flustered, letting emotion override substance. That was what Patel wanted. He wanted to provoke, to drag the conversation down into the mud where swagger and volume mattered more than truth. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't rattled. She tilted her head slightly, a small, knowing smile forming at the corner of her mouth. Her eyes never left him, unblinking, steady. It was the look of someone who had heard this kind of arrogance 1,000 times before and knew exactly how to dismantle it. The silence that followed her smile was louder than any words. The audience hushed, sensing that something was coming. Even the moderator caught mid-note, looked up, eyes widening. For a moment, time itself seemed to slow, the bluster of Patel colliding with the unshakable calm of Crockett. The tension reaching its breaking point, and then it happened. Crockett leaned forward, her voice low but clear, every syllable deliberate. The room seemed to lean with her, waiting for the strike. She had given Patel enough rope, allowed him to puff himself up, let him believe he had dominated the conversation. Now it was her turn, and with the nation watching, Jasmine Crockett delivered the line that would echo across the country. For a moment, the studio was suspended in silence. Kash Patel's last insult still hung in the air, bitter and heavy, but Jasmine Crockett didn't rush to swat it down. She let it sit there, let it rot under the lights while she leaned in. Eyes fixed on Patel as though she were studying a specimen under glass. And then, slowly, deliberately, she began. Her voice was soft at first, not timid, but controlled, the kind of calm that forces people to lean in. "You know, Kash," she said, pausing on his name, "it's funny how you keep telling me I don't understand the real world." She waited, let the words breathe. The faintest smirk curled across her lips. "Because from where I'm sitting, the only world you understand is the one where you clean up lies for men too scared to face the truth themselves." The effect was immediate. Gasps rippled through the studio like a wave. The moderators froze, their eyes darting from Crockett to Patel, uncertain whether to step in or just let history unfold. Patel blinked, his smirk faltering for the first time all night. His lips parted, but no words came. He looked stunned, not because the jab was loud, but because it was so precise, so undeniable. Crockett didn't pounce. She didn't need to. She let the silence do the work, let the audience marinate in what she had just dropped. Then she leaned back slightly, her gaze still locked on Patel. "You think arrogance is the same as strength?" she continued, her tone steady, deliberate. "But arrogance is just weakness wearing a mask. And every time you open your mouth, you prove that mask is slipping." The room shifted. You could hear murmurs running through the audience, a few claps breaking out before the moderators attempted to hush them. Cameras caught faces in the crowd-raised eyebrows, stunned expressions. Even a grin or two as people realized they were witnessing a moment that would replay. Endlessly by morning, Patel tried to regain his footing. He cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. "There it is," he said, his voice wavering just enough to betray the act. "Got the dramatic soundbite for Twitter." "Congratulations, Congresswoman. You got your clip?" But Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned forward again, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Oh no," she replied, her voice crisp as glass. "This isn't for Twitter. This is for every person you and your friends tried to silence. This is for every truth you tried to bury. And if the truth ends up trending, Kash, that's not my fault. That's yours." It was surgical. Each line carved into his composure, stripping away the smug armor he had worn so confidently. Patel shifted in his chair, his hands fidgeting with his notes, eyes darting as though looking for an escape hatch. But there was none. Time seemed to slow. The camera zoomed in on Crockett's face, calm, unbothered, even a touch amused. Which wasn't performing rage. She was performing precision. And that was what made it lethal. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Patel red-faced, sputtering, visibly rattled. Crockett, serene, measured, utterly in control. And then came the line that detonated the moment, the one destined to be clipped, shared, and memmed across every corner of the internet. She tilted her head, her voice dropping into the kind of cadence that makes every word feel permanent. "Kash, if gaslighting were a career, you'd be its CEO, but out here in the real world, the world you claim to know so well, facts still matter. And that's why you'll never win a debate with me, because I don't need to lie to look strong. Just need to tell the truth." The studio erupted. Applause broke through, unstoppable now. Some in the audience stood to their feet, clapping, cheering, while the moderators struggled to regain order. The camera cut to Patel's face, stiff lips pressed tight, eyes darting. Down to his papers, he tried to smile, but the expression was broken, brittle, a mask that no longer fit. He opened his mouth as if to reply, but whatever he had prepared crumbled on his tongue. He stammered, shifted, finally forcing out, "That's cute, real cute." But the damage was done. His words fell flat, drowned out by the resonance of hers. The contrast was devastating, his weak deflection against her unshakable truth. And Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't press further. She simply leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and waited. As if she had planned it all along. As if this entire exchange had been nothing more than a patient setup for a single, devastating punchline. For those watching at home, the moment was electric. The cut, the pause, the delivery, it all landed with the kind of precision that felt scripted but wasn't. It was real, raw, undeniable. People tweeted in real time, "Did she just say that? Replay that line again?" Clips of Patel's stunned face began spreading within minutes. Memes sprouting before the segment had even ended. Inside the studio, you could feel the shift. The balance of power had flipped. Patel no longer looked like the unflappable loyalist. He looked small, exposed, his arrogance laid bare for everyone to see. Crockett, by contrast, seemed untouchable, collected. The embodiment of dignity under fire. It was more than just a comeback. It was a mic drop moment, the kind of lightning strike that no spin or deflection could erase. And Patel knew it. His shoulders sagged, his smirk gone, his eyes fixed downward. But the moment didn't end in that studio. It couldn't, because the true explosion wasn't in the studio. It was online. The second Crockett's final words landed. The energy inside the studio transformed. What had begun as a tense standoff erupted into a scene that was equal parts catharsis and disbelief. Applause cracked through the silence, first in scattered bursts, then rolled into a wave that the moderators couldn't contain. Even a few of the panelists, seasoned commentators who had seen every kind of political skirmish imaginable, couldn't help but smirk. Stealing quick glances at Patel's crumbling composure, the cameras, unflinching, caught it all. Patel shifting in his seat, eyes flickering downward, fingers fidgeting with his notes, like scraps of armor that could no longer protect him. The man who had strutted into the studio brimming with confidence now looked deflated, his swagger reduced to silence. Meanwhile, Crockett sat steady, unmoved, as if she were merely waiting for the noise around her to settle so they could continue. That composure, that refusal to gloat, only made the contrast sharper. She had dismantled Patel without breaking a sweat, but the studio was just the beginning, as the true shockwave detonated the second those clips hit the internet. Within minutes, hashtags began to rise. Hashtag Crockett clapback surged first, followed closely by hashtag Speechless Patel. Twitter timelines became flooded with replay after replay of the exchange. TikTok edits sprouted up almost instantly, each remix more creative than the last. Crockett's mic drop moment set to dramatic music. Patel's stunned silence looped with comedic sound effects. Captions like when the assignment is destroy, but you turn and obliterate. By the hour mark, the clip had crossed 1 million views. By the end of the night, it was everywhere. Instagram Reels, Facebook reposts, YouTube Shorts. The exchange had transcended political media and entered the bloodstream of pop culture. Celebrities weighed in. Actors, musicians, and athletes who rarely dipped their toes into politics shared. The clip with captions like "This is how you do it," and "Jasmine Crockett deserves a standing ovation." Journalists, usually measured in their language, admitted on live broadcasts that they had replayed the moment more than once, just to savor Patel's expression. Late-night comedians got to work immediately, crafting monologues around Crockett's takedown. And then there were the memes. Patel's frozen face became an instant template, that look when you realize you're out of excuses. Attempted. Come back. That's cute. Real cute. It's clipped and rebranded as the internet's new shorthand for flailing in defeat. Meanwhile, Crockett's calm delivery became its own brand. The raised eyebrow, the slight smirk, the perfectly timed pause. It was the kind of authenticity that couldn't be manufactured. And that's exactly why it resonated. For Patel, the humiliation was inescapable. Every scroll on every platform seemed to mock him, to highlight his downfall.
Ow.
For Crockett, the admiration only grew. She wasn't framed as just winning a debate. She was framed as telling the truth, the rare kind of truth that cuts through partisan fog and resonates with anyone who has ever felt dismissed or talked over. It was validation, not just for her. Viewers online began attaching personal meaning to the clip. Comment sections filled with lines like, "This is for every woman who's been interrupted in a meeting. This is for every immigrant told they don't belong. This is for every person who's been talked down to by someone who thought they were smarter." Crockett's words had become more than a clapback. They had become a collective victory. And yet beneath all the noise, the hashtags, the memes, the viral edits, something more profound was stirring. Because what people were celebrating wasn't just a political takedown. They were celebrating dignity, composure, and the rare sight of arrogance stripped bare by truth. The world was laughing at Patel's collapse, yes. But they were also inspired by Crockett's.com, her refusal to be rattled, her insistence that facts and integrity could still triumph. And that struck a chord deeper than politics, because yet beneath the viral memes was something deeper, something that spoke to America's core values. When the dust began to settle, it was tempting to see Jasmine Crockett's clapback as just another viral gotcha moment, soundbite destined to live a quick life online before fading into the endless churn of political banter. But Crockett herself refused to let it be reduced to that. In interviews the next morning, in statements that followed, she made it clear this wasn't about her ego, and it certainly wasn't about scoring points. It was about something much larger, She reminded audiences that what unfolded on that stage was not a fight for personal glory, but a reflection of a broader struggle. The fight to ensure that truth cannot be drowned out by arrogance, that dignity cannot be erased by dismissal. Her words reframed the viral exchange, transforming it from a moment of entertainment into a moment of meaning. "This is bigger than me," she said calmly, as clips of her response replayed in the background of every network broadcast. Because when someone tries to belittle you, when someone tries to erase your worth or your voice, what they're really doing is showing you their own weakness. And when you answer them not with anger, not with the same cheap tricks, but with integrity, you show everyone watching that arrogance will always crumble in the face of truth. Those words hit a different register. They weren't just commentary. On Patel's unraveling were a universal call, a reminder to anyone listening that standing firm in dignity is itself an act of power. It resonated across divides, reaching people far outside of political echo chambers. Teachers replayed the clip in classrooms, pointing to Crockett's calm composure as a model for how to handle conflict. Parents shared it with their children as an example of courage under pressure. Advocates for women, immigrants, and marginalized communities claimed it as proof that integrity could pierce even the loudest noise. The cinematic arc of the story sharpened with every retelling. A man who entered with arrogance, a woman who answered with grace, and a moment that reminded America that strength does not lie in volume, but in conviction. Oh. The imagery was powerful. Smirk fading, the silence that followed, the explosion of applause and affirmation. It played out like a scene from a film, but its power was precisely that it was real, and that reality carried a moral clarity. Because this was never just a debate. It was never just a clash of personalities. It was, at its core, a reminder of who we are at our best. A nation that believes in respect over ridicule, dignity over dismissal, truth over propaganda. A nation that, despite its divisions, still cheers when arrogance collapses under the weight of honesty. The lessons swelled beyond Crockett and Patel. It became about what America could still be, a place where the underdog has a voice, where justice still matters, where integrity can still cut through the noise of cynicism. It was a reminder that the values enshrined in the nation's founding, respect, quality, accountability, are not relics of history, but living forces that can animate even a single televised exchange. And as the story continued to echo, as the clip racked up millions more views, what lingered wasn't Patel's smirk or even Crockett's line. It was the truth embedded in the moment, that courage, composure, and conviction will always outlast arrogance. That, in the end, justice and dignity still carry the louder voice, because this was never just a debate, it was a reminder of who we are at our best. Jasmine Crockett stunned Kash Patel on live television. In doing so, she gave America the moment we won't forget. What began as a smug dismissal meant to silence her became a turning point that lit up the nation. Not because it was clever, but because it was true. In that instant, Crockett reminded us that dignity will always outshine arrogance, that calm conviction will always outlast bluster. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a statement. A reminder that when the powerful try to sneer, to belittle, to erase integrity still has the power to push back and win. Patel's smirk faded, but Crockett's composure endured. And that endurance, that clarity, is what people carried with them long after the camera stopped rolling. Moments like this matter. They remind us that America is still capable of celebrating courage, honesty, and respect. They remind us that truth is not fragile, and that those who try to bury it often end up revealing their own weakness instead. Ow. That's why this clip didn't just go viral, it resonated. Because people are hungry for reminders that justice and integrity still have a place in public life. And that's where you come in. If you believe in amplifying these moments, if you believe in lifting up voices that defend dignity and speak truth to arrogance, then don't let this story stop here. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to see it. Add your voice to the movement that refuses to be silenced, the movement that celebrates strength grounded in honesty, not bluster. Because moments like this remind us we are stronger when we stand with the truth. And together, we can make sure that truth echoes far louder than arrogance ever could.